Our speaker this evening, therefore, brings us insights that are not only timely, but urgent. Professor Kristen Heyer holds her bachelor's degree in history from Brown University and a Ph.D. in theology from Boston College, where she specialized in Catholic social thought. She has taught successively at Loyola Marymount University, Santa Clara University, and is now, and I understand I am the first to say this out loud, a professor of theology at Boston College. Dr. Heyer is the author and editor of numerous articles and books. I want to mention just two of these. In 2006, she published Prophetic and Public: The Social Witness of U.S. Catholicism, for which she won the Best Book Award for 2007 from the College Theology Society. In 2012, she published Kinship Across Borders: A Christian Ethic of Immigration. These are but two in a long list of contributions in both print and in conferences. Indeed, even a brief look at her CV makes one wonder when Professor Heyer sleeps. Tonight she will address the topic, Justice Across Borders: Immigration and Family Values. Please join me in welcoming warmly Professor Kristen Heyer this evening.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Paul, for that very kind introduction. And thanks also to Ed Hannenberg for the invitation to join you this evening for this series. I'm grateful, too, for the warm hospitality I've received today from old and new friends here at John Carroll. I thought I'd begin this evening with an image that is perhaps familiar to all of you. An image of 5-year-old Sophia Cruz breaking through security to meet Pope Francis during his recent visit to the United States. Now, I watched the footage of this, maybe you did too, soon after it happened, and I panicked a little bit at first. I thought, if there are images broadcast of security holding back this 5-year-old girl in her effort to reach the Pope, I thought that'll be a really regrettable and yet perhaps representative symbol. Instead, Pope Francis reportedly asked his security detail to let her come to me. Sent by immigrant rights groups, Sophia gave the Pope a letter asking the Pope to advocate for mixed status families like her own. Just wanted to open with a few excerpts from her letter. I am an American citizen with Mexican roots. Every day, I'm scared that one day they will take my parents away from me. All immigrants, just like my dad, feed this country. They deserve to live with dignity. They deserve to live with respect. They deserve immigration reform because it benefits my country and because they have been working hard harvesting oranges, watermelons, carrots, onions, spinach, and other vegetables. So whereas family values, discourse in our churches and on the campaign trail typically focus on marital and sexual norms, Sophia's pleas highlight the harmful familial impact of migration policies. Christian ethics challenges patterns like those her family endures. Its relational vision of the person contests the reductive market ethos that profoundly influences migration experiences from local all the way to global levels. And in turn, the realities that migrant family members endure challenged what I would say idealized notions of family values. And so tonight I'd like to address each of those intersections in terms of the US context. To begin with, I'd like to share a few reflections from my own experiences with migrants, which I would say nearly universally signal the centrality of family separation, along with the ways a Christian narrative challenges our dominant lenses for understanding immigration and political discourse. This is maybe particularly heightened during a presidential primary season like tonight. So thank you, by the way, for being here instead of watching the debate tonight. And then after that, I'd like to return to understanding immigration as a family values issue, and suggest some resources that the Christian tradition has to offer in this regard, as well as signal a few growing edges where perhaps the tradition warrants re-examination at this moment that the Synod on the Family occasions. So during my last visit to the binational Kino border initiative in Ambos Nogales at the Arizona-Mexico border, I spoke with recently deported migrants at their aid center. One gentleman had spent 26 of his last 27 years in Central California, brought there as a 1-year-old by his uncle. He had worked harvesting pistachios and almonds to support his wife and his 4 U.S. citizen children without any trouble, even on the occasions he would be pulled over and couldn't produce a driver's license for a routine stop. But in the past 2 years, each such stop had landed him in jail, the third resulting in his deportation to Nogales. He expressed dread, really, at starting over in a country that was foreign to him. Up the road here at Casa Nazaret, I sat with women on the Sonora, Mexico side of the border who were planning to reattempt the journey north despite the dangers that it posed. The women at the shelter were simply desperate to be reunited with their families in the U.S. One had worked at a Motel 6 in Arizona for many years, supporting her 2 citizen children on her own after her husband had left them. And when someone in our group asked, why did you leave to begin with? She said, at home in southern Mexico, either you eat or you send your kids to school. The Nazareth House residents repeatedly broke into tears as they shared the pain of being separated from their children and as they shared their experiences in detention. On that trip, desert walks along the Arizona side also brought home to me our border fortification strategy that maximizes the risk of death. And whereas the rule of law rightly occupies a privileged place in our country, I was struck during a visit to an Operation Streamline hearing in Tucson at the sharp contrast between our law and order rhetoric on the one hand and the lack of accountability or transparency in Border Patrol procedures on the other, or really the lack of due process afforded the detainees. So if you go to these hearings, maybe you've seen this in person or in pictures, there are young people shackled at the wrist and the waist and the ankles and then collectively herded through these processes, most lacking sufficient time with an attorney to comprehend what was happening, and that day a few were lacking adequate translation. Closer to home, I've encountered undocumented college students while teaching in California, similarly really struggling with impossible choices. So I begin my recent book with one who recounts how a month after her high school graduation, ICE agents with loaded guns, bulletproof vests, steel-toed boots surrounded her house and nearly pounded down her front door. As she puts it, quote, "I came out to the front yard where the head agent asked my name while pulling out handcuffs as if standing in front of some criminal. No GPA or letter of recommendation could save me then. I fell to my knees in front of the agent and began pleading with him to let me stay, telling him I was starting college in a couple of months on a special scholarship. He said, fine, I'll let you go, but only if you tell me where your dad is. When her mortified mother nodded yes to go ahead and tell them, the student revealed the information and ICE left to arrest her father in front of his coworkers and deport him. The student reflects, I stood in complete disbelief. I had sold out my own dad for an education." So experiences like these, wherein questions of citizenship and enforcement tactics take on flesh and blood, have shaped my reflections about the Christian narrative in light of migration. Despite significantly beefed up fortification, we're hearing a lot about building more of a wall lately. The U.S. spends more today on immigration enforcement than all other enforcement activities of the federal government combined. The recent increase in arrivals of unaccompanied minors and families from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala rekindled fears of a border out of control. Whereas our immigrant nation's celebratory narrative, you can think below this picture of the Statue of Liberty of Emma Lazarus's poem about huddled masses yearning to breathe free. We typically talk in terms of hospitality, liberty, and democracy, and yet our legislative debates about immigration have historically centered around issues of national security, economic instrumentalism, and social costs rather than human rights. So we can return to these in the discussion perhaps. I think conceiving of immigrants as only posing security threats or economic threats or threats to our identity as defined over and against an outsider reveals some legitimate concerns about life and community together. But I think on their own, they threaten to distort the whole picture. And these lenses can sometimes mask realities and become surrogates for other social and political concerns. Actual encounters with reluctant or desperate migrants can alert us to the significant dissonance between these dominant political assumptions and the inhumane impact of many policies and practices. So if fear or profit largely holds sway, dehumanizing newcomers according to dominant scripts of lawbreakers or takers alone, I would suggest the Catholic traditions the Catholic commitments shape a different story, a counter-narrative of our common humanity, our kinship, with implications for a just immigration ethic for families like Sophia's and those in Nogales. So I want to start with a little bit about a Christian immigration ethic, to set the stage for the forces that are affecting these families. One of the most persistently recurrent themes in Scripture is justice and compassion for the vulnerable. The prophets repeatedly connect bringing justice for the poor to experiencing God. Concern for the economically vulnerable recurs throughout the New Testament as well, particularly in the Gospel of Luke, which depicts Jesus as inaugurating his public ministry in terms of bringing good news to the poor and releasing the oppressed. So in his parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus identifies neighbor love and just living with care for the vulnerable stranger among us. This is an image I like, actually, of the Chinese artist He Qi, who now lives in Minnesota, and was excited to get my request for permission when he heard about the immigration context. Recall that here Jesus reverses the lawyer's expectations with the story of a perceived enemy's loving response to the one in need lying in the ditch. Jewish audiences would have been shocked, right, to hear of a discredited priest and a Samaritan exemplar. In the parable, the priest and the Levite notice the wounded man, but they kind of keep their distance to avoid any contact that might defile them. Unlike the Samaritan, who sees the man as a fellow human being in distress, the others really don't allow themselves to be affected by his plight. By sharp contrast, the Samaritan apprehends the situation just as the man in the ditch experiences it. And typical of Jesus' parables, where the extraordinary keeps breaking out of the ordinary, the Samaritan goes on to really surpass the aid that would even be appropriate for a fellow countryman to aid this stranger who might belong to his ethnic group's worst enemies. So as Bill Spohn notes, Jesus stretches the limits of vision and compassion precisely where fear, enmity, and inconvenience want to constrict them. So how might this parable, where Jesus exposes the lawyer's categories as too cramped, shape imagination about responding to immigrant families? Posing the lawyer's very question of who is my neighbor erects boundaries between members and outsiders. We quickly remove ourselves from the scene to kind of balance abstract duties and obligations. Perceptions of immigrants as threats alone significantly influence immigration analyses. So this prior question of perception shapes our assessment. Whom do we see as the immigrant? Freeloaders who take advantage of American generosity while taking jobs from U.S. citizens? Men lining up outside the Home Depot? Outsiders overcrowding our kids' schools? The college student whose narrative I recounted? Sophia's family. I think if we see the face of immigration as illegal, anchor babies, forever foreigners, or if we see separated mothers, displaced small family farmers, taxpayers, we pursue different avenues of analysis. Seeing immigrants' humanity as primary doesn't magically solve problems about stretched resources, conflicting claims, cases of immigrant crime. Yet it does foreclose on death-dealing fortification strategies, and it invites us away from simplistic scapegoating. To get at root causes and complex motives, like the Samaritan, we must identify with and become neighbor to the immigrant. So taking the victim side as our own enjoins not only compassion, but also liberation. Just as the Good Samaritan promises additional recompense to the innkeeper, Christians are called to enter the world of the neighbor and leave it in such a way that the neighbor is given freedom along with the very help offered. I would say the lack of freedom, the unfreedom of present and would-be migrants pointedly illustrates the urgency of this responsibility. So this hospitality, this Christian hospitality, which is radical hospitality that shapes our imagination, does not reduce immigration to a question of charity or largesse, but it requires justice. So immigrant families encounter legion forms of injustice. And I'm just going to give you a quick example. I'm sure all of the students here are well-versed in these different philosophical and theological versions of justice. But I think they help give you the scope of what I'm talking about. So commutative justice, I would say the standard treatment of day laborers violates the standard justice in exchange. So I used to live in Los Angeles, and the day workers that I would talk to at our East LA parish would always talk about being hired by someone to do maybe landscaping or painting work for the day, get hired, go work for the day, and at the end of the day, have the employer say, great job, but I'll meet you tomorrow right here, same time, same place. And then I'll just pay you for both days at the end of the second day, right? Never to be seen again. Actually, the Midwest and the most recent survey I've seen, migrant laborers reported about 30% had experienced wage theft. Second, the regional juxtaposition of relative luxury and misery, while basic needs go unmet, challenges basic notions of distributive justice. So the nearly 2,000-mile border at the US-Mexico border bisects the sharpest average income divide on the planet. The impact of free trade agreements and utterly outmoded visa policies impede persons' active participation in social life, social justice. So healing migrants' wounds then demands meeting basic responsibilities and justice, especially with this last element here, given the role that the United States has played in shaping conditions that directly contribute to irregular migration. So the Catholic tradition's understanding of human rights and the political community squarely challenges the fact that the vast majority of contributing and vulnerable migrants, like Sophia's parents, remain excluded from a viable, timely path to citizenship and its protections. Catholic principles of economic and migration ethics establish persons' rights not to migrate. That might be the most important first right. A right to be able to fulfill their human rights in their homeland, and then a right to migrate if they cannot support themselves or their families in their nation of origin. Once people do immigrate, the Catholic tradition profoundly critiques patterns wherein stable receiving countries accept the labor of millions without offering legal protections. We could call this the help wanted. I'm trying to think of the other sign that no trespassing and help wanted signs kind of simultaneously being held, right? Such shadow societies risk the creation of a permanent underclass, harming both human dignity and the common good. The Catholic social tradition makes clear that every economic decision must be judged in light of whether it protects or undermines human dignity realized in community. So this idea that the economy should serve the person raises serious questions on this issue, not just about the freedom of markets compared to people on a global level, but also about the significant financial stakes in a broken immigration system. Detained immigrants fill privatized beds. Deportations fill private buses. In fact, with the spike in newly arrived unaccompanied minors and families about a year ago last summer, the share prices for the private detention corporations like GEO and CCA spiked. The share prices in terms of their improved federal real estate portfolios, you could say. Amid Pope Francis's critiques of the dictatorship of faceless economies, his images of humans as commodities in a throwaway culture, I think particularly resonates with vulnerable migrants' experiences. The Southern Poverty Law Center interviewed 150 undocumented women across various sectors of the food industry, and these respondents overwhelmingly reported feeling like they were seen by their employers as disposable workers with no lasting value, to be squeezed of every last drop of sweat and labor before being cast aside. So this operative market logic that fosters push and pull factors also obscures immigrants' full humanity as mothers and fathers and children. Today, 16.5 million people in the US live in mixed status families, with tens of thousands of US children, citizen children, undergoing the deportation of a parent annually. Recent decades have witnessed the feminization of migration, and women on the move face particular threats, from sexual assault by smugglers to abuse on the job. So in the US context, the heightened border enforcement since the mid-90s has contributed to this feminization trend, as it became more difficult to travel back and forth without documents seasonally. Many male migrants extended their stays and arranged for their families to join them. But significantly more women are also migrating on their own as well, or as heads of households today than in the past. And the top general contributing factor, which I'm sure is not news to you, that while half the world's population, women continue to perform nearly 2/3 of the world's work, receive 1/10 of its income, and own 1% of the world's property. So less likely to qualify for employment-based immigration than men, most migrant women work in the informal sector. Domestic work, for example, regularly leaves migrant women victim to exploitation through long hours, isolation, and low wages. Whereas undocumented immigrants earn lower wages than citizens in the same jobs, women routinely earn less than their male counterparts. So in the fields and in the factories, undocumented women are typically perceived as perfect victims of sexual assault. They remain isolated, uninformed about their rights, and they're presumed to lack credibility. Women farm workers hide their gender with baggy clothing and bandanas. About 80% of women of Mexican descent working in California's Central Valley reported experiencing sexual harassment, as opposed to about 50% of women in the workforce who experience at least one incident. Dolores Huerta characterized this pervasive reality as an epidemic in the recent Frontline documentary, Rape in the Fields. Beyond well-founded fears that reporting abuses will risk job loss and then family separation via deportation, women lack access to legal resources and face language barriers and cultural pressures. These threats to migrant women's well-being frequently impact families on both sides of the border. Family members' material needs in countries of origin frequently compel migration, and in receiving countries, immigrants must negotiate familial separation, including prolonged periods waiting for reunification, and then again, this fear of deportation as they work to provide for their families. You know, many send remittances for this purpose. Significant visa backlogs have prolonged family separation and resulting undocumented migration. Today, backlogs remain so long that people often will switch lines as they age out of one long line or get married and qualify for another. Roughly 4 million U.S. citizen children who have one parent residing in the U.S. Without immigration status will experience the deportation of their parent. And then in the immediate aftermath of that, families experience major economic instability, and the associated fear and stigma studies are finding often lead to depression, anger, and social isolation among the affected children. So these factors taken together have a profound impact on child development and well-being. And such really foreseeable consequences violate fundamental norms regarding human dignity and care for the vulnerable. Enforcement mechanisms continue to dismantle trust between immigrant and law enforcement communities, risking unreported crimes. So the first time I went down to the Keno Border Initiative, I guess 6 or 7 years ago, I met a woman who had been deported from Los Angeles after living there for 2 decades because she called to lodge a domestic violence complaint. And so her adolescent and younger children were now in LA trying to figure out what to do while she waited to make her next move. So I think this chilling effect is really felt. Hence, even though family reunification has been a cornerstone of the U.S. immigration system in recent decades, these growing backlogs and new restrictions and a backlash against family preference contribute to the realities of prolonged family separation and then the undocumented patterns that result. So whereas threats to family values in our ecclesial and our political discourse often focuses on same-sex marriage or contraceptive coverage, these families of mixed immigration status face acute threats to their well-being. Policies that prevent immigrant workers from maintaining basic dignity and family unity, again, I think they obscure our full humanity as grandchildren, as spouses, as parents, as extended kin. So Christian ethicists have long critiqued the impact that the institutions and ideology of a free market economy have on the family when they've written about issues like welfare policy or wage policy. And as market forces sever religious ties, family ties, even political ties, globalization's rhetoric of increased freedom and interconnection, in fact, conceals bondage and displacement. So on the Isle of Lampedusa, as was mentioned in the introduction, Pope Francis condemned this global economic idolatry that leads to migrant deaths, and he repented with those of us. He said, "We've forgotten how to weep," and then what astonished me was he didn't condemn the world out there, but he joined and repented in this penitential liturgy with those of us whose soap bubble indifference, as he called it, anesthetizes us to such tragedies. He went because he said the news of these migrant deaths off the African coast reached him like a thorn in the heart. And I think you're right, it did shock people that was his first official visit of Rome. But as voices from developing countries emphasize, threats to family from a culture of death include these forces that uproot families and include a poverty that haunts and demeans. Hebrew and Christian scriptures are not only replete with injunctions about hospitality to strangers, but also with examples of families uprooted and migrating, revealing a pattern not unlike what economic refugees face today. Families forced to uproot themselves, leaving behind homes, relatives, friends, familiar language, security of their provisions and land, the support of their communities. And a Christian family ethic offers significant resources for reorienting the immigration paradigm I began with. I think in a few constructive ways. First, it's profoundly relational vision of the person. I may have written, good. Anthropology, if you're taking notes for a class, is just a fancy word for its vision of the person. This idea that to be a person means to be in relationship. The family as domestic church, that is a basic cell of society and a mediator of covenantal love, and then the family's social mission. So the sanctity and the social mission of the family developed in Christian family ethics reorients immigration stakes away from deportation quotas or the fiscal bottom line. Families comprise our most intimate relationships, such that protracted separation really threatens our very human subjectivity. Despite intermittent family values rhetoric on US political and religious scenes, this relational vision of the person, I think, confronts a culture with a primarily individualistic ethos, also one that doesn't value caregiving labor. The credo here in El Norte, that we pull up our bootstraps and make our own fate, I think is as entrenched as it is incompatible with this Christian idea of solidarity, that we share one another's fate. Whereas a Christian anthropology does not compromise autonomy, its understanding of persons as interdependent critiques this rampant exploitation of immigrants at personal, policy, and cultural levels. Policies that undermine family unity then frustrate this core relationality. Ada Maria Isasi Diaz characterizes the family as the central institution in Latino culture, noting that it functions as a duty, a support system, a primary identity marker. So for those migrant women whose agency is caught up in motherhood, then the inability to provide for or reunite with children can fracture integrity and really identity in profound ways. Flowing from its social anthropology, Catholic social thought integrates this, the family's intimate communion with its charge to mutually engage the broader social good. If families serve as basic cells of civil society, as schools of deeper humanity, as we are reminded in the Synod conversations, then social conditions must protect their participation in the demands and the benefits of the common good. So what I've outlined this evening, deprivation of dignified work opportunities, these traumatic enforcement mechanisms, these signify hostile social forces that really block immigrants' families' access to social goods. Pope John Paul II connected families' call to reveal love and bring children into the world with its vocation to practice hospitality and give witness through an option for the poor. This intimate connection between family and society, he cites a decade later, characterizing the family as a community of work and solidarity, whose countercultural witness requires robust social supports. So if the vision of family in Christian thought is not just this haven from the mean world out there, but also has this social mission, then policies and conditions that perpetuate family separation really undermine human subjectivity, and they harm the common good. So even this very brief retrieval of the sanctity and the social mission of the family, I think, squarely challenges these harmful immigration policies. Yet I'd also like to add that some of the social contexts that we've explored suggest some caveats about more idealized notions of the family or typical understandings of family values that hinder flourishing, particularly for migrant women and for otherwise vulnerable family members. So I would just like to mention a few. So first, it's not only neoliberal capitalism or callous attitudes that harm immigrant families. I would say assumptions about the complementarity of the sexes that often lurk below ecclesial family ethics bolster uneven burdens for the work of social reproduction with ontological status. So even with his praise for women's immense contributions to the church at the Philadelphia Cathedral, Pope Francis continues recent papal emphases on women's feminine genius, which he notes find a particular, even if not exclusive, expression in motherhood. The language that he has used suggests that a deeper theology of women need not meaningfully contest this separate but equal status that hinders women's flourishing in public and private venues alike. So I think assumptions about the nature of women and also of caregiving work have conspired to make aspects of women's labor invisible, to legitimize a second shift felt most poignantly by women at the lowest economic rungs, and increasingly to pit women against one another in shouldering the work of social production and in shouldering the bearing and raising of children, elder care, and so forth. A lack of shared responsibility for the daunting demands facing mothers in the low-wage workforce is frequently camouflaged by lip service to a pretty narrow construal of family values. So as upper and middle-class women have been liberated from some domestic tasks, in many cases this is accomplished by relying on low-wage workers, and they're frequently undocumented workers. And in this way, it duplicates gendered labor and reinforces traditional divisions of labor. So whereas one class of women may gain liberation from these kind of tasks in the service of workplace participation or maybe leisure, this dynamic ensures that the work remains women's work. Anthropologist Jennifer Hirsch describes this outsourcing of caring in the developed world in vivid terms. Quote, "Now the changing of diapers of both the very young and the very old, as well as the cleaning of toilets of those who are, however temporarily, between Huggies and Depends, is done largely by darker-skinned hands." End quote. So this shift in the organization of social reproduction, I think, is largely left out of conversations about citizenship and work, and it too often remains peripheral to ethical discourse on family life. So the nanny from Manila who raises the children of working parents in Manhattan is pushed not just by, we could say, this global capitalist order to which commoditized love belongs, but also about assumptions about the nature of caregiving work. And I think just as a narrow focus on marital or sexual norms can blind us to these social factors that harm families, dominant portrayals of marriage and family can sometimes issue inadequate ideals. An emphasis on the spousal meaning of the body in terms of utter self-gift alone can yield a marital ethic that risks overlooking some of these social forces that abet exploitation and violence. So I've talked about exploitation of women on the move or protracted family separation, conditions fostering loneliness, sex that are documented. These can really damage marital and family relationships. The iconic Christian symbol of motherhood of the Virgin Mary peacefully cradling a newborn baby, as my colleague Kathy Caveney has written, does not fully speak to the experiences of many women who must work tirelessly to feed and protect their children. I was talking about raising children and balancing the tenure track and finding sleep. I like the idea that to find time for sleep. And I have to say, kind of peacefully cradling my two sweet baby boys is not the image that springs to mind in terms of the challenges of motherhood, right? I think similarly, a disproportionate emphasis on Our Lady of Guadalupe's innocent purity and compliant motherhood at quinceañera or other feast day celebrations can fail to connect with women's felt concerns in harmful ways. So attending to the concrete pressures facing transnational families may help our church better appreciate the violence, the fragility, the cultural forces beyond just relativism or the sexual revolution that directly impact families' lives. Building up families demands social supports that concretely value caregiving work, economic and political policies that unite rather than divide families, and authentically conveyed witness to the equal dignity of women. Impediments to citizenship and to economic security highlight the shortcomings of social policies, but also the shortcomings of just moral exhortations that focus on families changing their behaviors alone. So, some conclusions. If the Good Samaritan and the experiences of migrant families attune us to see the face of immigration in the women at Casa Nazaret, we're reminded that migration decisions are rarely personal choices alone. So a migrant woman's decision to abandon her children for better long-term prospects for them, or her decision to have relations with another male migrant traveling for protection, or as I speak with women at the border, as is really increasingly widespread, the decision to inject contraceptives because they can pretty much count on being assaulted on the journey or on the other side, or work without documents. All of these choices occur within very constrained situations and contexts. So I would say none of these means are morally or otherwise desirable, but I think understanding better the realities shaping these choices can highlight for us the shortcomings of absolutist categories or individualistic paradigms, even approaches that privilege autonomy or purity. Such women's experiences underscore the inadequacy of approaches that really just flatly criminalize immigrants. So what part of illegal don't you understand? I think the US criminal justice system and Christian churches alike too seldom focus on these enduring structures and ideologies or attitudes that really abet sin and crime. The experiences of migrant women can help alert the church to these inadequate notions of agency, really inviting kind of an ongoing healing, not only of migrants, but a healing ad intra. Christian understandings of economics, human rights, the social mission of the family issue a prophetic immigration ethic. And yet the treatment of migrants raises justice questions not only for civil societies, but also for churches. A pilgrim church witnesses to the reality that in Christ there are no longer strangers and aliens, even as its human dimensions demand ongoing conversion, including by way of newcomers. Pope Francis's culture of encounter may serve as a countersign not only to a culture of isolation and exclusion, but also to more conventional models of church as fortress, or just as shepherd to its flock, or teacher to its pupils. Pope Francis's own dialogue with the existential extremities offers us a way forward. I think that's the hope for this synod, that kind of genuinely open and wide-ranging conversation being engaged during its remainder. Standard talking points that highlight scheming lawbreakers or demographic threats fail to register the social contexts that compel migration along with its harmful consequences: ruptured family lives, border deaths, and gender-based violence. But the church's field hospital is poised to heal the harm that these patterns incur. On the paradigm of Lampedusa, where we find the church embracing pain with humility, may the church heal migrant families in need, in the shadows, and in separation, and may the church penetrate its anesthesia of the heart, treating her own wounds, whether if she's finding that she treats migrants as passive beneficiaries or fails to authentically witness to the equal dignity of women. So my point is, even when dominant political lenses conceal with their false narratives, sometimes dominant ethical frameworks can also obscure genuine values when they overlook vulnerable agents' pretty complex experiences. The resilience and struggles of women on the move and families in limbo challenge narrowly construed notions of family values. So I'd like to close with a reference to Mark's pericope of Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman. Hopefully you remember this story from the Gospel of Mark, the woman seeking healing for her daughter with an unclean spirit, and at first Jesus denies her, and then she says, "Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's scraps." Maybe it's coming back to you. So let's just take a look. Here it is the outsider, a Greek, Syrophoenician by birth, a pagan, a woman, who reminds even Jesus of the centrality of God's reign, of a kinship that transgresses boundaries. We again encounter features of a story that reverse expectations. A woman directly speaks to Jesus. It would have been unthinkable for an unknown or an unrelated woman to approach him in this way in terms of Mediterranean honor culture. Jesus initially refuses to help the woman, even insults her, we might say, in contrast to his attitude prior, even to non-Jews. And it remains a bit unclear why Jesus changes his mind and agrees to heal her daughter. But at a basic level, the persistence of the woman in need ultimately reminds Jesus of the radical inclusion of the reign he proclaims and inaugurates, really a new countercultural way of being. The acceptance of marginal groups evidenced here and in so many of Jesus' parables that really annoy us, the ones that irk us, because they're not fair. The people who worked only an hour got the same wage as the people who worked all day. The prodigal son is greeted, as readily as the dutiful son. We're not supposed to bring our friends to the banquet, but strangers gathered from the highways. All of these really countered the evaluation of people by class and status that was more characteristic of first century society. But I think these reversals provide a paradigm for the manner in which a new vision marked by justice and kinship can be understood and enacted in our day. So to go back to the Good Samaritan, if we consider the gospel call there to take the victim's side as our own, and then taking the female victim's side or the vulnerable agent's side as our own, heeding the Syrophoenician woman's plea, genders immigration ethics in the face of demographic shifts. Today, I would say many immigrant women similarly exhibit courageous risk-taking and resilience in the face of steep odds as really the linchpins of transnational families in need. The Syrophoenician woman's lesson from the periphery also invites us to ask what we learn from migrants' experiences that the rich resources of the Christian tradition can be tempted to overlook. Hence, sustaining families as factories of hope, as Pope Francis has called them, exceeds important conversations about communion for the divorced and civilly remarried alone. It demands humble listening at all levels, including, I think, creative efforts to reach families in the shadows or in transit in order to build upon existing commitments to families' inherently sacred and social dimensions, to build toward more inclusive and reality-based norms for Catholic families and communities. So as the ongoing work of the Synod begins in recent weeks, really gets underway as everything concludes in Rome, and it begins at home in the coming weeks, locally, may we foster courageous and charitable dialogue across borders about how best to enact equal dignity, mutual love, and families flourishing. Thank you. So I'm within my time limit, and Ed says I can field my own questions, so I'd be happy to take questions or comments from the audience.
Really interested in ways to overcome some of these taxonomies that we use so often, the taxonomies of illegality or burden. Think about the rising brown tide. Some of these things,
Nice.
the floods, the infestation, we have to fortify against. And in our work that we've done on justice work around immigration, we really struggle to produce a counter narrative that reaches some resonance. And there's such a resistance to anyone even being willing to entertain anything else. And what have we found is a solution to that?
Is successful? That's the million-dollar question. Thank you for the question. So the question about how to counter some of the damaging rhetoric, dehumanizing rhetoric, rising brown tide, or fortification-only solutions that we talked about at the outset. I think those lenses, the three lenses that I started with, I don't know if this goes backwards. Oh, it does. Those lenses have a grip, not always like at an intellectual or rational level, right? But at an emotional level. There's really a sense of personal identification around this issue, not uniquely, but pretty profoundly. When you talk to people about their feelings about immigrants, you quickly peel back layers of family history. I did it the right way, so they should get in line. It's unfair, even if I'm from the same country, kind of intergenerational divides. Or you find you don't have to have blatant xenophobia or blatant racism to have kind of fear of the other or uncertainty about what does that make our American identity with these demographic shifts, and really only able to understand who we are over and against the outsider, I think you really find some of those fears distorting, like I said, some reasonable concerns. So that can be hard to measure, but I think about 5 or 6 years ago, a political science study was interesting to me that gave respondents the exact same news story about an immigrant. One was Jose Sanchez and one was Nikolai Sandinsky. And so the differences in result made it hard to deny kind of the role of race. And we've seen anti-Hispanic hate crimes kind of skyrocket in recent years. So when you're dealing with that, kind of getting the argument right isn't always the solution. Like I noticed, I don't know what he'll say tonight, but that Governor O'Malley kept saying, even if you can't get behind kind of things I said tonight, it's the right business solution. But I don't think saying there's more economic benefit than deficit really penetrates some of those less rational arguments. So what have I found? Personal encounter is pretty hard to substitute. So I've talked sometimes to lawmakers or lawmakers' aides who, when they will go to the border, will say it changes everything. Just it becomes a lot harder to generalize about why people come when they sit down and have conversations and find a lot more in common than they think. It's kind of impractical to send everybody on Capitol Hill who won't pass any comprehensive reform to the border. So I do think I was talking with, where is Sister Rita Mary with the diocese, earlier this evening about the value of bringing firsthand testimony. She was saying often bringing, whether it's an unaccompanied minor who's getting legal assistance through the diocese or a family member, can really have a powerful impact on people putting themselves and identifying with, wow, if that was my son, what decision would I make? I also find in my own work, I've started using poetry and art in addition to narrative, because I mean, arguments are important, but there's still a lot of resistance to the Christian human rights argument. And so if a lot of our ethical decision-making has this non-rational component, then reshaping imagination, I think, is pretty important. So the immigration book that was mentioned at the outset, I found this poem called Imagine the Angels of Bread by this former tenant lawyer who's now a poetry professor at UMass Amherst. And I thought, oh, this is perfect. It kind of exactly breaks open. I don't have it with me, or I'd make you sit through it, because it's fabulous. Yeah, I won't try to recite it. But then my publisher said, you have to pay a lot of money to copy a whole poem into a book, which devastated me. I wrote him and he said, well, what's the basic argument of your book? And when I wrote it to him, he said, you can have it for free for the cost of 2 copies of the book. He said, I'm not religious, but I want to be a part of that. So I really think experimenting with things that can reshape imagination is at least as important to countering this resistance, to getting the human rights or economic arguments right. It was a long-winded answer. Please.
I think sometimes it's frustrating for us who have an empathy for the migrant and the immigrant to kind of turn back around, even as you mentioned earlier, the debate that's going on. How can you have an impact? So can you, or you called someone out in the crowd, some concrete things that we could do when we leave here with some of these thoughts about changing the narrative and what does the immigrant and the migrant look like? Do you have some suggestions from your work, what we could do when we leave here tonight to kind of move this along so that we could put our value system, to make it known to those who can do something about it?
Sure, to enact this. Excellent. I learned at dinner that Cleveland is really a model in terms of its reception and support for the recently arrived unaccompanied minors. So the newspapers talked about this as this surge, to go back to these unhelpful narratives of youth. A couple of you before the talk mentioned the New York Times article on Sunday, which kind of outed the U.S. as outsourcing some of its prevention strategies to Mexican apprehensions. And yet here in Cleveland, there's this, I might put her on the spot actually, she's right in the row in front of you, has been this model program of providing free legal advice, even providing a place to stay overnight for folks who have to drive 4 hours from Southern Ohio to show up for an 8 a.m. hearing. And it makes such a demonstrable difference to have legal counsel. 12% if you don't, I think 80-some% if you do, having some viable options forward. So getting involved with your diocese's own, she mentioned advocacy, outreach ministry, and accompaniment, I think, in terms of legal aid. I think also it is an election season. Unfortunately, you're seeing, unfortunately to my mind, a real, almost extreme polarization of views on this, I think almost appropriate to this time. I mean, I hope you won't see this in the general election, but people typically, no matter what the issue, right, in order to kind of distinguish themselves from other primary candidates, at least on this issue, I find really out extreming one another on this issue. And yet, we've had inaction for so many years. We even have a candidate who was part of the Gang of Eight who passed a Senate bipartisan, imperfect but progress bill that just languished in the House. So I do think putting pressure on your legislators, if you're interested in a Catholic approach, the U.S. Catholic Justice for Immigrants campaign has a lot of really helpful resources on their websites and ways to make it easy for you to pressure your representatives, whether you care about the presidential election. A lot can be said, though, in a campaign, as we can see. I mean, a lot of people had a lot of faith, for instance, in President Barack Obama, who, as you probably know, has deported more than his predecessors, fewer in the last year and a half by a long shot, and I think has really tried to make use of executive action. But I do think working at the local levels is important, and not just writing off politics, but if there was really political will, if the side on reform were as annoying on the phone as the other side, we could see more movement. So contributing to a more well-oiled political machine, as well as these more local outreach and advocacy efforts, would be what I would say. Do you feel too put on the spot if I ask you, Sister Rita Mary, to say what's going on in Cleveland?
No, I'm glad. We have 3 areas of concentration. One is education, by inviting people in, providing opportunities for people who actually have had the experience to come and talk about what the experience was, why they even left their country. So many of us are not aware of the reasons why they've come here. So education is the first. The second is advocacy. It's so discouraging to hear a legislator say, well, for every 10 negative responses I get in regard to immigration, I have 1 positive. So we're not speaking up. We're not saying what we believe, what we think should be done. So we need to advocate, write letters, send postcards, make phone calls, really advocate, participate in opportunities that provide for you a way to express, this is what I believe we should be doing, this is who I believe we are. And then the third is assistance, providing assistance, accompanying those who have come. And our speaker mentioned one way in which we're trying to do that here in the Diocese of Cleveland. We have the only immigration court in the state of Ohio, which means that anyone who crossed the border, as they cross, mothers and children and unaccompanied youth, they're put into deportation proceedings, which requires that they appear in court or appear to the ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, at least once a month. So people who are living in Cincinnati have to get themselves to Cleveland once a month to appear in court or to appear at ICE. That's a long trip. So what we tried to do when we realized that was happening is to have a way for them to get here inexpensively, and Greyhound Bus does that. We meet them at the bus station. If they're coming for an 8 o'clock appointment in the morning, we provide a family who will provide housing and food for them overnight, get them to court in the morning, and then take them back to the bus station. Also last year, because so many of them, this was their first winter, they were wearing sandals or little flip-flops in December, January, and February. So, you know, we realized we needed to provide them with warm clothing. That's a very practical thing. Also, there's need for tutors who can teach English and help the children in school, teaching English to the adults. There's so many ways that I think we can, helping them in filling out forms, those are all things that can be done. Does that help?
Thank you so much. I'm just going to add one that might seem pretty unacademic and not so pastoral, but the kind of three-tiered approach that you just described reminds me of the origins of the Kino Border Initiative. Actually, the Jesuits in California were asked to just send a priest. They said, we have a parish that's understaffed. Could you just send a person, a warm body? And the California Jesuits said, well, we want to be more intentional about how we respond to the reality of the border. And they undertook a pretty extensive needs assessment. And the other side of that was this combination of education and advocacy and meeting immediate needs, and a lot of advocacy in DC. But one of the things they found, in addition to the particular vulnerability of women who were deported, unaccompanied women, was that the closer people got to the border, the less people wanted to have honest conversations about immigration. So you had parishes, ministering to undocumented parishioner and border patrol alike, sitting side by side in the pew. And you had, as a result, people not wanting to touch preaching on immigration with the 10-foot pole, and also very little honest conversation among people, even in these border communities, many of which were binational for years, and the border was kind of artificial. But I don't think, in my experience, speaking on this issue, that that's confined to southern Arizona. And so I think something else you could do when you leave tonight is talk about this issue. Talk about this issue outside of John Carroll. Talk about this issue where it seems impolite, like at a cocktail party. You guys can go back to your class and tell your professors the Christian immigration ethic, and maybe you disagree, maybe you agree, but there's a context here for this Catholic approach. But I think there's a lot of misconceptions, and the scripts, the dominant scripts that are fear-based, that the first questioner asked, have a strong grip on people's imagination, but agreeing to disagree or not bring up this issue in polite company, I don't think really forges a new path. So that would be a very small thing you could do, but I think it's desperately needed.
You made reference to 4 million kids are of deported parents. Was that 2015 numbers, or has it decreased or increased?
That was, I think, 4.5 million of the last time. Those are not 2015 numbers because we won't have those till next year, but I think they're last year's numbers. I think that's correct, although now I'm questioning that I'm sure it's higher as of 2015 because it would count a lot of these unaccompanied minors, but as you know, those have dropped off. So those are 1.5 to 2-year-old numbers. Sure. A great resource for that when we do have this year's numbers, in my opinion, is the Migration Policy Institute. It's a nonpartisan group that puts out, I think, a lot of reliable data on demographics and numbers and countries of origin and ages and marital status and family status. Sure. Dee.
I just have a factual question. Under whose watch and how was the money allocated to pay Mexico to keep people on the way through Mexico out of the United States? Whose watch?
This administration, this administration. We had the vice president talking about vetting claims in countries of origin, if you remember, about 9 months ago. And then, as I understand it, it's this presidential administration and ICE and Homeland Security who've taken on this, which is another way of outsourcing this problem, right? There was a lot of public outcry. And again, this wasn't a border state issue. This became a 50-state issue, right? The unaccompanied minors, they're here in Cleveland. They're all over. So it's not just California and Texas negotiating, again, real concerns, real we can't even provide for the homeless in our community, how do we absorb this? Or maybe undocumented workers work under a false securities number, and so they're paying federal taxes, but then that doesn't match up to the local allocation, so there's not really parity in terms of benefits to absorb this. So my understanding, it was, well, a cynical understanding would be in response to that public outcry with the visibility, but not at all stemming the root causes, as you're pointing out. I mean, I mentioned the phrase outsourcing of caring in terms of kind of transnational nannies, but honestly, this is an outsourcing of enforcement as well that keeps public visibility in this nation abated, but doesn't make any policy changes about categorizing refugees, especially, these are not just economic push factors, as we know, but the rising violence in these Northern Triangle countries, the Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. I think actually, we talked about rule of law paradigm. In many cases, ironically, you have people seeking a rule of law, right? You have, in some cases, gangs taking over with impunity. And so ironically, there's fleeing for safety, fleeing for economic viability, but really seeking the rule of law, getting cast as the lawbreakers kind of threatening our own security. I have to say I was struck by Pope Francis. I don't know how many of you watched his address to Congress, but when he talked about immigration, if you notice, he didn't talk about, I don't know why he didn't use kinship, radical hospitality. No, I'm just kidding. He didn't use any of these categories. He talked in terms of the golden rule, which, I don't know, in teaching ethics, maybe you disagree, but sometimes that seems a pretty low bar for, who's not in favor of the golden rule? But I found it very powerful how he then framed that. If we ourselves seek life, how do we not offer life? If we ourselves seek security, how do we not also offer security? So anyhow, I also went on a long tangent on that one. Yeah.
I think one more question.
One last, okay.
Many people think that Miss Cruz, who got through the security guards, it was a staged event.
Yes, it was.
And also, taxpayers don't like to pay for immigrants because it gives government more control, and there are many evil people in government and evil, wealthy corporations and wealthy people who control the government.
I think I'm misunderstanding your question. Did you mean, was it a staged event, or did you also have a question? I apologize. Can you rephrase?
Taxpayers don't like to support immigrant people because it means more government control, and there are many evil people in government and evil people in corporations who control the government.
Okay, so a concern that may be one of the barriers to comprehensive reform that would bring, I talked about a mismatch, just to give you one example. We have about 5,000 low-wage non-agricultural visas a year, but the first decade of the 21st century, we willingly employed 800,000 every year. So not a slight mismatch, but an immense mismatch between available visas and our actual hiring practices. And so resistance to at least maybe reform some of our, let's say, visa capacities, maybe because of a sentiment that would give government or corporations too much control. That could be. I think there's been a lot of language in the midterm elections last year. There was a lot of language about takers, even after the Congressional Budget Office issued its findings that it would be a net economic benefit to have some sort of comprehensive legalization. I think there's a lot of deceptive scripts, and as I say, a lot of cultural and political concerns that get conflated with people's immigration positions. So it's a pretty complicated web. But in my view, one of the human rights issues of our day, so a pretty important one to commit to. So, thanks.
Join me in thanking.
Just real quick. When I look at your outline, it parallels to Reconstruction and slavery. Have you looked at any other parallel, or have you thought about that parallel? Because when I saw your outline, I was like, Well, that reminds me of the entire process of abolition through the civil rights movement, and then that doesn't give me hope that we will ever get to having open immigration.
I think there are really important parallels to be mined, especially we were talking earlier about the role of race and conflating fears, a shadow society without rights to parallel societies. I think there's a lot of important historical parallels, but I do not want your last note tonight to be of despair. I have hope and solidarity and the little things that we're going to go forward and do, thanks to Sister Rita Mary. Thank you, though.